welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica at Syosset Public Library with Turn the Page podcast, and I am really excited to have this guest on today. I just devoured her book. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your book?
Yeah, my name is Dionne, and I write psychological suspense. So my first psychological suspense was The Marsh King's Daughter. The book that just published is called The Wicked Sister, and both books take place in Michigan's Upper Peninsula wilderness.
It was just so good. Now, are you from that area?
Yeah, I lived in the Upper Peninsula for 30 years. My husband and I moved there in the 1970s as part of the Back to the Land movement. That was, really worldwide, but especially in the United States. Young people from the city who wanted to live closer to nature, just sort of packed up and moved to the country. Some moved to communes. We bought a little piece of property and we lived in a tent while we built a cabin, and we carried water from a stream and sampled wild foods. We ended up staying in the Upper Peninsula for 30 years. So it's definitely a place that's dear to my heart.
It seems the way that you describe it in the book, and I'm going to get into the book and the characters, it fits so well because there's a real fairy tale aspect to the book, and there's a lot of dark fairy tale narrative woven within the story. It seems the way that it's described, and having been a resident of there for 30 years, I'm sure that it's described beautifully and perfectly, that it's like a fairy tale land unto itself. It's beautiful and brutal at the same time.
Yes, it can be. When I was researching a little bit for the first novel, the Marsh King's Daughter, I learned that Michigan's Upper Peninsula has 29% of the land area of Michigan, 3% of the population. So that just gives you an idea. You can literally go for, dozens of miles and not see another person. So that setting, that isolation, gives me a lot of wiggle room as far as the story events in my novels.
And it really worked out very well. So this is the story. It's told from the perspective of Rachel, who has lived more than half of her life in the word is not sanitarium. I think that at one point she mentions that they used to be called sanitariums, but now it's changed. I guess a mental, a hospital or a rehab for the mentally ill, yeah. I suppose.
Yeah, the institution that I'm using really did exist, and colloquially we always called it the mental hospital. That's probably not PC anymore, as you say, but that's what it was known as.
We have several of them on Long Island that are defunct, I think the word is, and they're imposing, they're like characters unto themselves. They're just these big imposing cities of buildings, right, with history. But Rachel, when you first meet her, she's there because she has this very distinct memory of killing both of her parents.
Right.
And you learn very early on that she is an unreliable narrator, but you're not exactly sure why. And the other perspective is from somebody who you later learn is, it's Jenny, who is Rachel's mother.
Right.
And Rachel herself doesn't come into Jenny's story until much later on. And the focus of what happens seems to revolve around Rachel's older sister, Diana, who is absolutely terrifying. Yes. I don't want to give too much away, but things involving Rachel's behavior and questions as to whether or not she was involved in accidents compel Jenny and her husband to move to a family lodge in the Upper Peninsula. On the other hand, you have somebody who is visiting Rachel in the hospital and shows her the police report, which proves that she absolutely could not have been the one to kill her parents. And in the backdrop, you see Rachel's love of nature, her parents' love of nature, and the shared stories, the fairy tales that she and her sister loved. How did you come up with just this tapestry?
Well, that's a great question. So let me back up a little bit. My first psychological suspense, The Marsh King's Daughter, which is also set in the Upper Peninsula wilderness, that follows roughly, the story structure follows the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale of the same name, The Marsh King's Daughter. And so when it came time to write my follow-up book to The Marsh King's Daughter, I knew that the book should share certain qualities with The Marsh King's Daughter, but obviously I didn't, as an author, I wasn't just going to do the same thing over again. So rather than use just one fairy tale to structure the story in The Wicked Sister, I'm so pleased that you said that the whole book has kind of like a fairy tale vibe, because that's what I was going for. Rachel grows up at this beautiful log cabin on 4,000 pristine acres of wilderness. And the cabin is really over the top. I shouldn't call it a cabin, it's a hunting lodge. And her great-great-grandfather built it. It has a copper roof, stained glass windows, Tiffany lamps, Navajo blankets. It's just really over the top. And that's reminiscent of a fairy tale castle in a forest, right?
Yes.
And then, Rachel grows up there with her sister, and as you mentioned, the two of them, they act out fairy tales as games, like, for instance, Hansel and Gretel in the woods, because, well, why not? You're two children growing up in the woods. What else are you going to do, with your imagination?
Of course.
And there is an element that is not really, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to mention it, because it's on the first page of the book. Rachel has such a strong connection to the natural world that she believes that she can talk to animals and insects, communicate with them on a almost a spiritual level, which, again, many fairy tales have talking animals in them, right? So
Yeah.
I was playing with those elements in the context of what is really a very tragic story, because Rachel, she's been punishing herself for 15 years in the mental hospital, believing that she's responsible for her parents' deaths when she was 11. So that's certainly a tragic. And to research the novel, I read accounts of people who had accidentally killed someone, and it's horrific. How you would, that becomes a part of you. It defines who you are. You can never get free of that. Yes, you can go forward and have a productive life, but there's always that knowledge that you took someone else's life. So
Right.
that's a very heavy burden that Rachel has, for the bulk of the novel. And when she finds out that she most likely did not do this thing, of course, she wants to then pursue the truth, because of the trauma of that day, she has very fractured memories. She doesn't clearly know what happened. But yeah, and so then the other half of the story is Jenny's, Rachel's mother, which I think it's interesting. The reader knows from the first page that Jenny meets an untimely and tragic end. So as she's narrating her half of the book, she's basically, showing the reader how that came to happen. And I think as an author, it was interesting to write her story, because she knows things that Rachel couldn't have known, obviously. And so by telling her story to the reader, then the reader also has more knowledge of what's really going on than Rachel does.
And the imposing figure of Diana, who drives the fates of everybody in the story, where did she come from? And I want to get back to the title a little bit later, because there's a few twists in it, and it definitely, I mean, when you start reading, and it's not a spoiler to say that one can call Diana the Wicked Sister, but it's much more complex than that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for recognizing that too. Yeah, so Diana's character was inspired by friends in real life who many years ago, they adopted three siblings. And the younger two did really well in the new environment, but the older one didn't. He had some behavioral issues. Of course, they tried to get help for him, but it just got worse and worse. He was violent towards his younger brother and sister. And so at the age of 12, they had to put him in an institution. And that just always stuck with me. And I thought, how heartbreaking. What an impossible decision for a family. It's almost like Sophie's choice, right?
Yeah.
Choosing one child over the others. And yet, they had to do that. So that's the issue that Jenny is dealing with. And yes, as you said, it's no big spoiler to indicate that, to let readers know that Diana has some serious problems. But she's their child. They love her. They want to do the best they can by her. They're not going to just throw her away because of a few issues.
And they really do. I mean, they make like concessions in their own values to try to almost foster some sort of compassion from a place of things that she liked, things that she is attracted to, even if those things frighten them themselves.
Right.
And
right.
there's a real love between the parents. You're not really sure at first if oh, this is going to be their breaking point, but they really did love each other very, very much. And they loved their daughters a lot. So, and this is the point where I feel like I'm getting to say a little too much, and I think
Yeah.
that our readers should absolutely be picking this book up. But on the only sisterly relationship was not just Diana and Rachel. Jenny has a sister who comes to live with them as well, and that's Charlotte, who seems like a secondary character, but you realize she's really not. Even though she's in the background, a lot of what happens is of consequence, I think, to how Charlotte relates to the children.
Right. And so in a sense, I'm exploring two sets of sisters, Rachel and her sister Diana, and then Rachel's mother Jenny and her sister Charlotte. And I have two sisters. Maybe that was part of my selection process for choosing this topic. I just think it's so interesting. And I had also three daughters, and sisters can be very, very different. They can be peas in a pod, or they can be exact opposites. And, but yet who's closer to you than your sister growing up? So, yeah, it was fun to work with two pairs of sisters.
Yeah, I thought that it was a really nice touch. You describe a lot of the wildlife in the peninsula, and it seems absolutely breathtaking to me that you could be in your, I guess, I don't want to say your backyard because that means something very different to us here on Long Island, but in, I guess, your space, and to just see these majestic animals that we would probably have to go to a zoo or a preserve to see. What is that like? I mean, that in and of itself has to be somewhat, so where did you move from again when you?
So my husband and I, as a young married couple, were living in Detroit.
Okay.
My husband was a stoneware potter, and we made our living traveling around to art shows in a tri-state area, selling his pottery. That's what we did. So when we moved to the Upper Peninsula, we really didn't know anything about living off the land. In fact, anybody who knows the Upper Peninsula well knows that you're much too far north to grow hardly a vegetable garden, let alone sustain yourself. So our piece of property where we lived was right on the main east-west highway, because we were going to build a pottery studio and catch the tourists going by. So while we were without running water for several years, we could still drive to the grocery store, when we needed to, even though it was 25 odd miles away. But as you say, on that trip to the grocery store, it would be nothing to see deer. Maybe you'd see a coyote. A couple of times we saw a bear as we were driving down the highway. And so, yeah, you're surrounded by wildlife. And that first summer, I remember one time in our clearing, we were in our tent, and there was terrible, terrible noises all around the clearing, screams and rustling through the bushes, and we were terrified. We found out later it was probably a pair of raccoons mating. So we had no idea. It sounded like we were going to be eaten alive.
Wow, that's a really good story.
Yeah.
So here on Long Island, there are places you can see wildlife, but it's really not something you normally see. And years ago, my husband and one of my friends and I were driving around where the library is, and there is an area that tends to be a little bit more wooded than others, but you don't generally see wild animals there. Well,
Yeah.
It was late at night, and this stag with these beautiful horns just comes prancing in front of us. And of course, we stopped and we pulled over, and we just watched him gracefully leap into somebody's backyard, and it was like the entire world stopped.
It's such a delight, isn't it, when you get to see an animal like that
Yeah.
you don't normally. One time we saw a wolf, and it was winter, and we were going up a dirt side road with the kids in a minivan, and spotted this wolf some distance away, but clearly visible, clearly a wolf. So we stopped, so that, as you did, so that the kids could look at it. And my husband got out of the car, which the kids are like, "Daddy, no," but the wolf is not going to come chasing him down. And he tried howling it to communicate with it, but that didn't work. And
is that where you got the idea of a little bit of Rachel talking to animals? I mean, I would imagine it would be very difficult. And again, you clearly love folklore. It just like breathes through the pages of your books. It would be very difficult for, I think, somebody who's just so steeped in that world to not want to try to howl at that wolf.
Yeah. And the thing, so as I was writing both novels, there were so many times when I would put a detail in the story about the natural world, and I would think to myself, I never would have found this no matter how much I researched. I do enjoy doing research, and my early novels were science-based thrillers, similar to what Michael Crichton writes. The first one was set in Antarctica, and the second was set at Chaitén Volcano, Chile. And I did a lot of research, to try to bring those settings to life. But I really didn't realize until I started writing about the Upper Peninsula how much just comes organically. Like I say, because of having lived there so long, because of loving nature, and writing characters who also love the natural world. That's a real joy.
Again, I think we've brought this up. So clearly you love folklore and fairy tales. Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I like Hans Christian Andersen, I think, a little better than Grimm. Mm-hmm. I discovered as I was digging into it a little bit more, the language is much more lush, much more beautiful. The Grimm's tales tend to be a little spare, and they're sort of the same thing over and over again. In The Marsh King's Daughter, I use excerpts of the fairy tale at the beginning of chapters set in the past. And sometimes the sentences are just so beautiful. Like there's one passage at the beginning that I quote, where in the fairy tale, a beautiful Egyptian princess is sitting on a stump, which turns into the evil Marsh King, and he drags her into the swamp. And the last sentence is, "Great black bubbles rose from the slime, and with these every trace of the princess vanished." That just speaks to me. I'm like, oh, that's so beautiful.
I think that's in a way, it's got to be the difference between, you have Andersen, who wrote, he wrote all of his books, and Grimm's were taken from household tales and, sort of pieced together, which I guess is why a lot of them were very similar, because they would take different detours. Yeah. I did love that Snow White and Rose Red was mentioned in this book, because a bear does have something to do with the story. The rare white bear that Jenny finds and that endears itself to their family, especially to Rachel.
Yes, yes. And in order to research the bear part of the novel, so when I lived in the Upper Peninsula, there were occasions when I could have seen a bear. There was one time when I was heading out to pick some apples at an old orchard behind our property, and I was carrying my infant daughter on my back on a backpack. And so as I'm walking along this overgrown road, I came upon a pile of bear dung, and it wasn't too fresh, so I wasn't too worried about it. I kept going. The piles kept getting fresher and fresher. The last pile was practically steaming, and I thought, I really don't think I want to see a bear today. So, turn around and go home. So, but there is someone in the Upper Peninsula who knows a lot about bears. His name is Dean Oswald, and he runs a bear rescue facility not too far from where my stories take place. So there's no breeding at his place. He takes in orphan cubs and bears from facilities where, let's say, they were in a roadside zoo and they didn't have good living conditions. So he has about 50 bears on his property, and some of them, the ones that he's raised from cubs, he interacts with. There's a picture on his website of him, holding the head, the snout of a bear, and his nose, they're just nose to nose. So I went up north there and toured his facility, and he answered a lot of questions for me. One thing that I thought was really interesting about that is, with 50 or so bears on the property, it's a lot of work to feed them, through the late spring and summer and early fall. And he and his staff, they collect food scraps from area hospitals and schools and nursing homes and grocery stores, because bears will eat anything, meat or vegetables. But then once the bears head out into hibernation in late fall, they have absolutely nothing to do. All of the animals they're taking care of went to sleep for the winter. I thought that was pretty neat.
As somebody who is not a cold weather person, I always thought that bears have the 100% right instinct to just go to sleep during the winter.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like what I want to do, just pull my covers over my head and not have to leave.
For sure. And so, as you noticed in the novel, I'm not using bears as like a creature to be feared,
No.
a grizzly bear attacking campers or something like that. Bears are powerful. Yes, they can, do serious damage with a swipe of their claw. However, I wanted to depict them as a creature that's part of the natural world that should be respected and even admired.
Yes, the bears in the book were they were living parallel lives. They were having children. They were, on the same land, and it was very nice. So I have to ask if you're working on anything upcoming.
I am, yes. I'm working on a third psychological suspense, which will again take place in the Upper Peninsula. I'm discovering I haven't run out of locations or stories yet. And this one takes place on the shore of Lake Superior, on the northern edge of the peninsula. And what a lot of people who aren't from Michigan might not realize is that 4 of the 5 Great Lakes border the state of Michigan. We have a lot of inland lakes as well, but so there's water, and big water. These lakes, of course, you look out over them and you might as well be looking at an ocean. You're not seeing land on the other side. And Lake Superior in particular, it's the coldest and the deepest of the Great Lakes. I think it's the 3rd largest freshwater lake in the entire world. And in the fall, it has terrible storms. The weather conditions can just change in an instant. So the section of the shoreline where my story takes place in a little town called Grandparent is also known as the graveyard of the Great Lakes, because so many ships have gone down in that area, including the Edmund Fitzgerald that Gordon Lightfoot sang about. So that might give a little hint as to some of the story events in my next novel.
I can't wait to read it. Do you have a title yet, or you cannot reveal it?
I have a working title, and
Okay.
that could easily change, but the working title is The Counterfeit Granddaughter.
Oh.
And so I'm working with the granddaughter-grandmother relationship, which, a lot of grandparents are raising grandkids, that can be a very, very close relationship. And the main character, she is from the Detroit area. She makes her living running grandparent scams. if you know what I'm talking about. She calls up
I
an
know
older
what you're
person.
talking about, but
Yes.
please, for those of us who might not, what is a grandparent scam?
Yeah, so she calls up old people. She gets their phone numbers one way or another, and she basically pretends to be a grandchild who needs help. So it's like, Grandma, I've been in a car accident, or I'm in jail and I need bail money, or whatever it is. And the grandparent on the other end will say, like, Susie, is that you? And then, she picks it up from there. Yes, it's Susie. So this is what she does to make a living. And obviously, she's got a history as to why she's okay with doing this. She makes a grandparent call, and the grandmother ends up inviting her to come and stay with her. And, for reasons I'll leave for the novel, she does this. So that's how she ends up in this little town of Grand Marais. However, the grandmother that she moves in with, she's not necessarily who she claims to be, and she has a big secret in her past. So it's possible that she might be the counterfeit granddaughter of the title, if it gets to stay that.
So does this have I have to ask if it has any relationship to Little Red Riding Hood?
Well, there are shades of that, of course. It's a grandmother in disguise, right?
Of course. Well, I can't wait to read it. I'm very, very excited. Do you have a general idea as to when it might be out?
Well, I'm hoping to finish by the end of the year. And so it takes roughly a year for a novel to publish. We'll see how it goes. Everything is kind of topsy-turvy with the current situation. But it was... my first two novels, Marsh King's Daughter and now Wicked Sister, it was a bit of a wait. So I don't want to make readers wait so long for this next one.
Well, I'm very grateful to you for that. So I want to just thank you so much, Karen, for chatting with us and for writing your books. And we do hope that you would be maybe willing to talk to us again when your next book comes out so we can discuss.
Oh, I'd love to, Jessica. It's such a delight to talk to readers. An author spends hours and hours and hours alone in their room, but that's just half the process. The rest of the process of writing a book is having readers read it. So thank you for reading my novels and giving me a chance to talk about them on your program.
All right, wonderful. Well, again, to our listeners, Karen's books are The Marsh King's Daughter and The Wicked Sister, and her upcoming soon to be officially named novel hopefully will be out next year, and we'll be talking to her about it then. So this was Jessica with our guest,
Karen Dionne. Yeah.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.